Amazing. Well, welcome Max again. Welcome everybody at Landa. I guess starting with the purpose of this chat is going to be our first Landa Talks, number one. And the purpose of this is just bringing in external, internal experts a little bit further into their consulting career, just to share a little bit about their experience and learnings, right? So I'm excited to host Max. We actually shared teams at Uber. Great guy, amazing career. Excited for you guys to learn a little bit about his experience. So just kind of kicking off, Max, do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself, your career, how you got started?
Sure. Well, hi everyone. Nice to meet you all virtually. You can see from my screen, my name is Max. I'm based in San Diego, California. Been here for a few months. Career-wise, I started at Capital One, which is an American credit card company and bank. I was an analyst for their branch division for a couple of years, but hated every minute of it. I was working 30 hours a week. It was great, but I kind of felt useless. And so I joined Uber in early 2014. At the time, it was a pretty small company. They had just launched the city of Baltimore. I was living nearby in Washington, D.C. I figured I was 23. I didn't really have anything to lose by trying it. And I did, and it worked out. I ended up spending 6 years there in a bunch of different operations and leadership roles. I moved to Latin America for 3 years, a small stint in a city in Brazil called Belo Horizonte, and then 2.5 years in Mexico City, covering the Latin America region and building up the driver operations team from literally 0 people to what ended up being a team of like 30 or 40, helping launch things like the loyalty program, all kinds of interesting driver operations work, some of which Chuco himself worked on and owned. It was an amazing experience. And then my last year at Uber, I moved over to Jump, which was at the time a recently acquired bike and scooter company. I took on their head of US and Canada central operations role and built the central ops team. Loved it, but it was also incredibly exhausting. The org was a little bit of a mess, and everyone was trying to figure out sort of like how to make this business work. And spent a lot of weekends fighting, sometimes literal fires in our warehouses, and that ended up getting exhausting. So I left in early 2020. Was planning to travel the world for a little bit and take a break. COVID got in the way of that pretty quickly. So I got stuck in my very small apartment in San Francisco with not a whole lot to do. And after learning to do some of the basic life things like cooking that I had neglected to learn during my 6 years at Uber, I didn't have a whole lot to do. And so I decided, why not try consulting? Seems like it could do something part-time, maybe work with early stage startups, which is where I thought my passion was, and really kind of like validate if any of the things that I learned at Uber were going to be useful to other companies. Got a couple clients, really enjoyed the work to the point that I decided I wanted to go back to full-time in one of those companies. I ended up joining Incredible Health, which was at the time a Series A health tech company. I became their vice president of operations. When I joined, it was a company of 30 people. Operations was 8 people, and our ARR was 10 to 20 million, something in the low double digits. And then a year later, we had a team of 60 operations people in 3 times as many states, and we were approaching 100 million ARR. I left at that point right before the Series B raise. They're now a unicorn, which is potentially nice for my retirement. We'll see how it goes. And I came back to consulting, which I think is probably what I want to be doing long term. And I'm happy to get into the details of why I think it's a good fit for me. And obviously, we'll talk here about sort of like the journey into consulting to begin with. But yeah, that's what I'm doing now. I run my own consulting practice, focused on seed stage and Series A startups who are looking for their first operations hire or their first senior operations leader And I kind of act as a part-time or fractional COO or head of product to these companies.
That's amazing. I guess like just going back to, I guess like after your jump experience, there's this first step, which is like, what are you going to offer, right? So curious to hear, how did you get to that niche? If that was what you started with as well, or did it start like somewhere else? Curious to hear about kind of like that story, how it started, and then how you got to your first client. I feel like that's very interesting.
Yeah. So I've heard different guidance on this than the way I approached it. So take this with a grain of salt. It's either really useful advice, or it like I just got lucky. When I left Uber and started thinking about doing consulting work, I actually had no idea what I was good at. I knew a few things that I enjoyed doing. Like I'd done a lot of like SQL type pricing models and sort of like building out basic analytics for companies. I really enjoyed hiring. And I really enjoyed thinking about product and organizational strategy. But I don't think I could have put any of those things into a succinct statement to then say to a company like, here's what I can do for you. I had no idea what I was doing. So I started from the opposite end, which is I started reaching out to companies and people in my network who were either working at the types of companies I thought I wanted to work with, or who knew people that did, and basically saying, and I basically asked them, what are the challenges that your company or these companies are facing? Like, if you could wave a magic wand and solve 2 or 3 problems today, what would those problems be? And then when I got the answers to those questions, and the answers were all over the place. Like some of them were like, I really need a CTO. And some of them were like, I can't figure out product market fit. I want to know who my ideal end user is. I could then say, oh, that thing I did a lot of at Uber, or that thing I have no idea how to do, and it doesn't sound very interesting. So I basically started with what are the needs out there, and really like just assumed I knew nothing. And then after that, I honed the offering that I was going to make.
Makes total sense. And generally speaking, like I feel for you because you think you know a lot of stuff from being in operations in Uber, but like nobody else knows what that means. And
Totally.
It can, very, very generalistic. Curious to hear, like as you started hearing about these challenges, kind of like whether that niche or offering started changing as well, or you felt you kind of landed on this interim COO need from the start. Did that evolve over time as well? I'm curious to hear kind of how that went.
It has evolved a lot. It has evolved many times, sometimes devolved, like gone back to something I've done before. And I think I'm sitting here now, having done this for a couple of years, and am assuming that it will constantly evolve, and I don't know how it will evolve. But yeah, so my first client was a Series A trucking startup. They were basically creating a fuel marketplace for truckers, and they had like 4 people or 5 people. It was actually pretty small for a Series A company. They had done a really good job of building lean. And the way that I got connected to them was I'd actually interviewed at another company a number of years earlier while I was still at Uber. During that interview process, I had met the LP from the venture capital firm that led their seed round, and really hit it off with this guy. And even though I ended up declining the offer from that company, I stayed in touch with him.
Con los six packs sueltos.
Oh,
give me a second. Pato, can you?
yeah, no worries.
No?
There you go. So I ended up declining the offer to join that company, but I kept in contact with this venture capital guy, and I reached out to him and I said, hey, I'm thinking about getting into consulting. Like, my background from this interview process. Here's my resume. Do you think any other companies in your portfolio might benefit from my help part-time? And so he sent it out, and this company reached out to me and was like, yeah, we would love to use you for like 5 to 10 hours a week doing a bunch of different operations stuff. So that was the original niche or offering I had, was like literally an ops generalist, and I had no idea what that would end up meaning, but they were a client that would pay me money, and so I kind of figured like I'll do whatever they really need me to within the bounds of ethics and what I'm capable of. And I learned a lot during I think I worked for them for 9 months before joining Incredible Health, and there were a bunch of different things they had me do, some of which I thought I was great at. Like they had me build a pricing model, which tried to figure out like, what is the difference between what we are buying fuel for and what we can charge the truckers while still staying under the competitor's price. And it was like a nice combo of like taking their database and putting it into a Google BigQuery and then like spitting out an analysis for them that they could run every day. I did other stuff for them that I realized I was really bad at. So they wanted some help doing some like out of home marketing, like figuring out how to advertise on billboards around highways. And I had no idea, like I had not bought a whole lot of ads on highways before. And so I literally had no clue what I was doing. And after messing around with it for a couple of weeks and getting nowhere, I told the CEO, like, I don't think this is the thing you should have me do, because I'm going to do it terribly. It's going to take a lot longer than someone else would, and it's not a good use of your money. And he agreed. So that was a good learning experience. And then from there, I sort of honed it to, okay, like I can really help early stage companies figure out the things that they need to do to scale from a process perspective. So like that pricing model used to be someone just like manually flipping levers, and now I just deliver them a model that ran itself. And now those levers would be flipped automatically with some product help. And I can help scale by hiring the right people and managing your ops team so that you as a CEO can go do the things that a CEO is supposed to do. When I discovered that those were the things I was good at, it was a lot easier to sell to clients, because suddenly I knew what I was, what I could do for them, rather than being like, hey, I know a lot of stuff about ops. Like, I hope I'm useful to you. And since then, well, obviously I went full time and brought on a whole other skill set around fundraising and being a senior executive at a large and growing company. And then when I left again, I had really honed it to, I'm basically a part-time COO. You can bring me on without having, you don't need a full-time COO. You're going to just not have enough work for that person to do. And you probably can't afford a full-time COO for like the size that you are. So I'll come in, be a part-time COO. You can pay me obviously a lot less than you'd pay someone full-time. There's the right amount of work for me to be a part-time COO. And I can help you set up the company such that it's a seamless transition to your full-time COO whenever you get around to that.
Makes total sense. And I guess like you mentioned something that's like pretty hard, especially in your first clients, which is like client communications. I just kind of like setting expectations. So curious,
I've had a lot of failures on that front.
With these learnings, kind of like what can you share, I guess, in terms of tactics for new consultants, instead of just like managing expectations and keeping the communication going once you close the clients?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'm an expert at this, but I'm definitely an expert at how it shouldn't go. And so a lot of like learnings of how not to do it. And hopefully those will be helpful in sort of like skipping to the slightly better setups. I think one thing I've discovered, and I've heard a lot of other consultants say this, is setting boundaries is really important. And when I say boundaries, I mean in terms of like your own availability, what the scope of your work is, and when it's due. Because if you think about it from the perspective of a CEO or whoever your boss is going to be in your consulting work, they don't care a whole lot about your time, right? You're not an employee of theirs. You're a contractor of some sort. You're doing things that they inherently like don't really want to be dealing with. That's why they hired you. And so like they're just going to pile stuff on you, and not because they're bad people, just because like that's like the most efficient use of their time, is just to be like, hey, Pedro, go do all this crap that I need you to do, right? And obviously you as the consultant, particularly if you're not being paid hourly, that can quickly get out of hand. You can also get into a situation where if you haven't established very clear boundaries and expectations, you're going to run into the problem of you're going to have a lot of stuff that someone is expecting of you that you are not capable of delivering on time. And I very quickly discovered early on with my first consulting gigs that I needed to set some pretty clear boundaries in terms of my own availability, because otherwise I'd be hearing from a CEO at all times, and they would be expecting me to respond at all times. Like, they might be on the East Coast of the US and I'm on the West Coast, and they want an 8:30 a.m. meeting Eastern time. That's going to be a 5:30 a.m. meeting for me. And if I do that more than once every month, I'm going to be very unhappy and be screaming for full time again. Right. So one lesson I learned was just like, be very clear on my working hours and stick to them. Like, you're not going to get fired because you're unwilling to join a meeting at 5:30 in the morning. But if you don't say no, they'll keep scheduling it then. So that was one thing. The other thing is just being really clear on deadlines. So if your manager, your CEO is saying, hey, I need this piece of work as soon as possible, well, you should be clear on, like, is as soon as possible Friday? Is it next Wednesday? Is it 3 weeks from now? Like, let's talk through what it's going to take to build this thing, and then what's a realistic timeline to deliver it on, rather than just like, okay, I'm going to get this done as quickly as I can. You want to give yourself some breathing room, and also you all are very smart and capable. That's why you're going to get hired. You're going to have clients who hire you, and you're probably more capable than any of the folks they have in their company, and that's why they bring you on board. So even if you think you're taking a while to do something, keep in mind that you're probably going to move faster than most of their employees can. That's why you're there. So I think it's really important to set clear deadlines. And what you'll also see is that they'll keep adding more and more work. If you have a commitment of, I'm working 10 hours a week for you, give or take an hour or two, well, they're not going to be managing your time. You will be. So they'll keep tossing more and more work at you. It'll be really important to say, here's my current plate. Here's what I'm capable of working on. Do you want me to replace one of these things with this new ask? Or do you want me to wait to work on this new ask until these other things are done? So basically, like, change the conversation so that you're in control of your time and the inputs to your work.
Makes total sense. And you mentioned this at the start, and you're obviously like, you figured out consulting a little bit serendipitously. COVID happened, whatever. But like, curious to hear your take on why you think it made sense nowadays to go full time into consulting, kind of pros, cons, generally speaking.
Yeah. Well, I'll list more pros than cons, because one, you all are here for a reason. You're not uninterested in consulting, so I'll try to sell it a bit. But also, I'm still doing it, so hopefully that's a good indicator that it's a good route. I
think it's fine to do cons as well, right? It's not.
I'll do some cons for sure.
So it's good to have both sides. So yeah.
I will. I'm happy to dissuade people who are on the fence if it's not for them. I'll talk through both, but one on the pro side. A tremendous amount of flexibility, right? I have a much easier time sort of saying, like, this is when I wish to be working. I'm spending a lot less of my time in meetings than I did in the more corporate setting. It's just like a lot more of a flexible schedule, and I can make it work around my needs, which I really appreciate. Like, I live in San Diego. It's an awesome city. I want to spend time in it. I don't want to be stuck in an office from 7 a.m. till the sun goes down. And this allows me to do that. I'm currently working 20 to 25 hours a week. Another pro, I find that I get really bored quite quickly. I spent 6 years at Uber, but it was also in 6 different jobs. So I, had constantly had something new I wanted to be doing, or was getting bored of the old thing and wanted to figure out something else. Consulting is like that on steroids, right? You're not only renewing the types of problems you're solving on a much more frequent basis, you're also solving more types of problems in any one moment. As a consultant, you're being brought in probably to solve a bunch of different things for one company, but you also may have more than one client with 2 totally different contexts. 2 problems are a lot more interesting than one. And so I've really enjoyed the variety of work and the types of things I get to learn about just by kind of like being in the room. And then finally, the other major pro is like the potential for improved income is pretty good, right? Like, there's a world in which for far fewer hours you can be making the equivalent of what you would have made at a full-time job if you set it up correctly, and there's a potential to be making a lot more than that, which is obviously nice. The con side, I like many people suffer a little bit from imposter syndrome, where I'm like, am I really like worth this money to this company? Like, am I really that useful to them? And it's one thing to have that when you first join a full-time job. It's another thing to have that all the time as you're taking on new clients, right? So it's definitely something that if you suffer from that, it is very important to learn how to manage it effectively, because otherwise it's really going to drag you down. I think the other con is I imagine I will always have the concern of, well, if I lose one of my clients, I'm not going to be able to immediately replace them, right? So there's like that constant sense of insecurity. Now, that's natural. It's not like you have like a wait list of people to utilize your services, and if you lose one client, you just pick the next one up. Like, that's not how it works in consulting. But hopefully you can get to a point where you're making enough if you're making enough in the good times to subsidize you in the times between clients. And I think it's really important to have that expectation going in that it's never going to feel 100% secure like a full-time job might. And two, that you're going to have to figure out how to manage that feeling in order to enjoy the work and not be brought down by it.
For sure. Yeah. Psychology is a big thing on all this. Curious to hear,
Absolutely.
Because you made one last segue on just clients and keeping your pipeline full. Curious to hear, now you're full-time at this. How do you go about it? Like, what are some, I guess, practical tips that work for you in just kind of keeping that pipeline? Do you have any sort of schedule already in your calendar where you're like doing a little bit of lead gen? Curious to hear how you go about that.
Yeah, I think it's it's a combo of active and passive lead generation. I don't really think of it as like I'm going out and trying to find clients. I think of it as I'm going out and trying to meet people and stay connected with people, and learn, right? Like, I'm sure many of you have gotten sales pitches on LinkedIn message before, right? Like, for the most part, you don't give them the time of day because it's very obvious that they're making a sales pitch and that they want you to buy something from them. Whereas if someone reached out and said, hey, I'd love to just like learn a little bit more about your company, and just like meet because I find what you do interesting, or I find the types of problems your company deals with very interesting, I think it's a lot more likely that you would respond to that, right? It's certainly, for me, a lot more likely that I'm interested in a conversation than a sales pitch. And so I spend a pretty consistent chunk of my time every week just staying in touch with people I've worked with in the past or people I know in the tech space, just saying, hey, how's it going? Like, would love to catch up and just say hi. And not with the goal of being like, do you have any work for me? But rather just keep, maintaining that connection. One, I enjoy talking to people. And two, it's good to keep yourself top of mind because, maybe the next day that person comes across an opportunity that, oh, now I've got Max in mind for that opportunity. I'm going to connect those people. Whereas if I didn't talk to Max, maybe I wouldn't have remembered that he's doing this type of work. But then the other thing I'm trying to do is, particularly in the tech world and specifically in the San Diego tech community, I'm trying to build connections with people who either are running companies. Founders are often happy to talk about the work that their company is doing. And I found generally when I reach out to founders, they've been very willing to have a quick conversation with me and just tell me about what they're dealing with and ask me some questions. Also venture capital firms in the area, and other types of investors in the area. Spending time chatting with those people has ultimately led to a lot of opportunities. And I think feels a little bit less slimy to approach it that way. And it's also a lot more enjoyable for me because I get to learn about all these interesting problems that exist in the tech world.
Makes sense. Yeah, amazing. We have about, I guess, 3 minutes left, and I wanted to open it to the public. Just one last question. It's just like, any last practical tips that you think actually benefited your consulting career a lot? I know you started making your own podcast. You've developed your website. Anything in particular that you felt generally helped a lot in your trajectory?
Yeah, so I run a blog through my website that I post on every 1 to 2 weeks, and my idea behind the blog was like to basically become a resource for founders who were looking for guidance on how to be better leaders or just how to approach specific problems within their company that I happen to have a lot of experience in. So it wasn't meant to be like, oh, I'm going to generate leads through this. It was more just like, I think I have a lot of information in my brain and I feel like it might be useful to someone else if I can like get it out there. What has ended up happening is two things. One, writing about this stuff has helped me remember some of the experiences I've had that are ultimately very applicable to companies that I either am working with currently or might be leads later on. So I can talk through like, oh, I had that similar experience, like this is how it happened, in a way that I wouldn't necessarily just recall as I'm in the conversation without having written about it first. The other thing, and I guess this is like kind of 2 parts in itself. So that was part 1, and then there's part 2A and 2B. 2A, so I do get some outreach from people I used to work with being like, hey, I really loved what you wrote about this thing. And I actually know a founder who's dealing with this problem right now, and I'd love to connect you to. That's awesome when that happens. And I've generated some leads that way, but also people have reached out and said, I'm having this problem, like, maybe we'll be chatting about, I'll be in the middle of a lead generation call and I'll say, oh, I actually have written about this topic. Let me send you a link to it after we're done chatting. And that, that helps sort of like keep me at the top of their mind after we're done chatting, and hopefully it leads to more sales long term.
Makes sense. Yeah, amazing. Cool. Well, that was great. I guess like would love to open it up to, I guess, the public if they have like any other questions. We open just FYI, we're sharing a Slido link. Slido is this tool where amazing tool. You can ask questions, you can upvote them, downvote them. We used to use it a lot in Uber actually. Great.
Oh, yeah.
We shared the link there. We actually just got 2 questions there. So I wanted to open it up. If anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask a free form question, we can start with those, and then otherwise we can just go to the 2 questions that are in the Slido. Any takers? Any questions for Max?
It's late in the day.
Cool. Maybe Pedro, maybe you can kick it off. I know you asked one of the questions in Slido. Do you want to take the stage?
Sure. Well, first, thanks, Max. I've been taking a lot of notes. Yeah, I wanted to ask you about how you thought about your rate, like setting your rate. Did you start with thinking about your salary, the impact you were going to deliver? How has that changed over time? I'd be very curious to learn how you approach that.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't know that there's an exact right answer. I can tell you my approach and take it for what it's worth. I actually got this guidance from another consultant who I used to work with at Uber. And what he said was basically figure out what you would cost full time, right? So I looked at my last role when I left Uber and what I was making, and add 30% or so for whatever the payroll taxes and other costs that the company incurs by employing you full time. Add some expectation of bonus, whatever your average expected bonus is, and then you'll get some annual number, right? Divide that by whatever number of hours you want to work over the next year, and that's your rate. And in fact, the more specific that number can be, so for instance, instead of saying $100, you say $118, the more believable and more buy-in you'll get for that number. And so I approached it that way. I originally started out at $225 an hour. That was my starting rate with my first client. It has since come close to doubling. And the reason that I have been comfortable getting up to more around 400 something is, yeah, I've just had a consistent track record of like seeing that I've delivered value to these companies and that, it's worth bringing me on board. It reduces their risk significantly because they're paying me only part-time versus hiring someone full-time. They're going to bring me on board and I'll already know a lot about the problems that they're experiencing versus someone they bring in full-time has like a long ramp-up period. And so basically I've continued to increase it, and I may continue to do so until I feel like there's not demand for the service at whatever level I bring it to. But I guess the starting point that I thought was a really helpful one was basically, what would you make hourly in a full-time role?
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you. I have one more, unless someone else asks a question. So I'll just wait, and if not, I'll ask the second one.
Sure, sounds good. Thank you everyone for listening to me drone on, by the way. Hopefully it was at least somewhat useful.
Yeah, so I guess I'll go ahead. So I'm also curious to know, how do you think about time management? For example, when you have multiple clients going on, or for example, when you were at your last job, whether you were doing consulting also, and how did you divide your time?
So when I was in my last full-time role, I had one client who I worked with 1 hour per week. I got specific permission from the CEO to do that. She was fine with it. And I basically said to that client, like, I work a normal job. Here's when I can make myself available, like sometime later in the day or early in the day. And that worked out fine. It gets a little more challenging when you're balancing multiple part-time roles, like I'm doing now. First of all, just literally the calendaring aspect is really hard when you have like multiple Google calendars, your own personal one, then whichever one you have with client one, and then whichever one you have with client two. I'm going to put a link to the tool that I use in the chat here, because I have not found something that is better than it. And it's like $50 a year. And it's literally the only tool I could find that does something like this. It basically like takes all of your Google calendars, and then you can set it up to copy meetings between them, and you can show them as private, or you can show full details, such that if someone books a meeting with me with one company, it blocks off that time as busy on my other company's calendars, so that someone else isn't trying to book with me in a slot that I already have taken. So it's called Sync Them Calendars. It's literally like it's some Israeli guy who just like is an engineer and built this in his spare time. He's the only employee of this company, and he just made this little tool. I find it incredibly useful. It's a little hacky, but it's definitely better than anything else that I have found. And if anyone finds a better tool, please let me know. But if you end up with more than one client, this is a godsend, let me tell you. And I do not get any referral from this, so this is purely me just saying this is a great tool. But yeah, I think the other thing is just, you're gonna have to feel it out with time management, right? Like, you're gonna have to see what the expectations are of your clients. So like, I have one client, everyone's on the East Coast, but they all want to work afternoons and evenings. So like, I basically work with them for the most part from like 10 a.m. Pacific to 3 p.m. Pacific. By that time, they're offline. That works out great for me. But I've had other clients who like really prefer early mornings, and within reason, I have some control over that. But like, I can't just say, hey, these are my rules and you must stick to them. I have to have some sort of compromise between me and the client. And I also have to figure out what each of my clients wants, and then figure out between them, what time am I offering to one client versus the other. So far, I've found that every client has had enough flexibility that I've never had, if any, like a minimal amount of meeting overlap. And I've always been able to figure it out one off. But basically, having one master calendar and having the client saying to the client, like, I've set my working hours and you can see my busy and open slots, like, kind of solves that problem for me. And then my working hours are just whenever I want to be working on a daily basis.
Nice.
And I see a recommended other tool, so I'm going to take a look at this. Thank you, Pablo.
Yeah, we got more than we were looking for. That's great.
Amazing. Any other takers or last questions for Max?
I do have one quick question. Max, first of all, impressive trajectory. I think it's really inspiring for me. especially I'm
Well, thank
starting
you.
this consulting business. I do have one question regarding your rate. Have you tried, like, instead of charging at a specific rate in terms of money, have you tried to charge some sort of equity or option in the company you're
That is
advising?
a great question, and it has made me realize that I did not communicate my compensation agreements properly. So when I say the hourly rate that I'm charging, I mean like the approximate amount that I should be making per hour, but it is not how I actually charge the client. I strongly recommend staying away from hourly agreements because it creates very weird incentives. You're going to want to take longer. The client's going to be confused about why they're being charged so much. Set it up as a monthly amount. That's what I set up with all my clients. It's a monthly amount where I say it's going to be this many thousand per month. And the expectation is that I work approximately 5 hours per week. Now, some weeks might be less, some weeks might be more, but it should average about that. And I'll let you know if I'm going over or under that amount, such that we can either adjust our contract or adjust the amount of work you're giving to me. And then some of this is actually sometimes equity. The problem with equity is unless you're going to be there long term, very few startups want to give like one random person who's been there for 3 months, a piece of the company. They don't want you on their cap table. So my setup is basically like, I'm happy to take some of that compensation as equity. And then if I don't stay long term, that converts to cash, if you as a company prefer that.
Cool, thanks.
Amazing. Cool. We have like 30 seconds left, but wanted to thank you, Max. That was like super insightful. I know a lot of like good nuggets that I'm going to take in as well. I guess last question for you, like, I know you just made your podcast, like anywhere these folks can find you, find your content, your podcast.
Yeah, definitely feel free to reach. I mean, if anyone has any individual questions, please reach out on LinkedIn. You've got my name here. Also, it's myname.com is my website, just maxwenneker.com. I'd be more than happy to chat individually if I can be at all useful to you all.